Hello, hello. I think this is on, and this is Mark. Okay, we do this, and I can see myself. Hello, everybody. My name is Mark. We're just getting started right now, and today I will be having a chat with you on, as of the 1st of April, what is going on with COVID-19, how are things working. So I'll just let a few people hop in, and I will see how this stay on this page. I will stay on this page. On this call, I will be chatting about latest research, latest projects. Hi, Steve. Good to see you. And we will be getting into all kinds of cool things. I've also got a set of questions that have been shared with me already, and so we will go into those questions right now. As we talk about this at the moment, we're just under 1 million people infected officially. We can talk about how many more people will be infected on top. Now, as a population of 8 billion people on this planet, yes, okay, fine, people still call it 7. Call it 8 billion is handier. We're talking a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of a percent. In addition to that, there are many sad, tragic deaths. For those of us who have lost parents, etc., etc., these are very tragic. And every story has a thing. However, 2,100 people over 65 die every single day in Germany. And nobody closes the whole economy down for them, nor did anybody close the economy down for my father. So it is interesting how our chosen response in most countries at this moment have got so fixated on the sort of closing down of our sort of life as we know it, potentially for months. We can discuss this. Clearly, we have the solutions appear to be working in that many countries are beginning to see the peak of their infections almost being reached. Deaths continue to rise as healthcare systems get overrun. And we still also see a difference in how countries are responding. We have countries like the United Kingdom that started off in one direction and then switched. Same thing with the United States. We have countries like Brazil, where they have a federal approach, and yet different states are taking their own approach. We also see an interesting battle of the science and the scientists. Whilst it would be lovely to say science is pure and there is only one true answer, doesn't really make sense. And we're seeing then really a battle for mind share of different approaches. And that mind share gets more and more tricky as more and more people experience the side parallel issue of the virus, which is potentially being made unemployed, having a business go bankrupt, and not working for a number of months. By the way, this is open for comment. I can't quite see how many people have joined. This is event logs. Okay. Facebook has just changed the way that they give me information for my chat thing. So I have no idea how many people are on, but I will assume it is more than 1 and less than 1,000. Some things that I'm working on personally directly. So what is interesting is that when there are times of issues, troubles, trauma, it's interesting to see, well, okay, what can I do? What is my role? In my case, I exist to help others, and I typically like doing some bigger things rather than smaller things. And some of the projects that I've been working on are primarily around, let's say, how do we get back to something that looks a little bit like normal? And that means primarily, how do we build up immunity in our populations as a more permanent solution to either, and with that immunity, either to slow down its progression, particularly through the vulnerable population, and going from there, how do we have a population that is, let's say, sort of more robustly looked after for this particular virus that we're fighting, so that we can begin to travel again, meet our friends, hug a loved one, hug a stranger, all the things that we used to do coming back. In addition to that, because our chosen response to the virus in the majority of countries involves closing down human activity at mass scale, these have consequences. The United Kingdom, for example, is going to help out self-employed people by giving them money. And they will do their assessment of how much money. That will only start the first week of June. And the challenge for many people have is that they look at the watch, and at the time they said that it was March, April, May, June. And many people don't have savings. And this is when we see the coincidence of the virus plus the devastation of the economy because of the chosen response to the virus. You begin to see that we will have many problems, and in some cases it'll lead to, in the developing world, more like sort of mental health issues, stress issues, which will have its own consequences. Or you end up in Asia. We're looking at India. The World Bank already says that 11 million people will be moved into poverty almost immediately. And you have many countries where people pretty much live day to day, so their day wage pays for that next day's worth of food for families. So unfortunately, we're going to be looking at a world where for many people, the response to the virus will kill them. I mean, it just will absolutely kill them. And I do find this as an interesting, let's say, sort of bigger picture idea, because for me, it allows us to sort of think about, let's say, how much value do we place on life? How much value do we place on death? And why is one disease more important than another? And why should one disease specifically close down everything and everybody else has to take a back number? Now, potentially, if this thing was more like SARS and killing 10% and killing people indiscriminately in the streets, I guess Trump was saying, hey, if I didn't do my thing, people would be dying in the theaters. They'd be dying in hotel lobbies. I think he's thinking of zombie movies rather than this particular type of thing, even SARS. But it is it's an interesting challenge that we see about how our society is more like SARS and killing 10% and killing people indiscriminately in the streets. I guess Trump was saying, hey, if I didn't do my thing, people would be dying in the theaters. They'd be dying in hotel lobbies. I think he's thinking zombie. It's the, hang on for a second. Why is let's see. Back page, where'd my video go to? Okay. Hopefully my video is still there. Hopefully I'm still here. Hopefully so. The Facebook changed the interface. Low value add. Okay, so I'll just assume that it's still recording and the video is still there. So the chosen way that our various societies have responded to this, now already those are quite interesting, because then if you look at, let's say, how were these choices made? Excellent, thank you very much, Abdul. Good. How were these choices made? Well, they were made democratically, in that the majority of our countries around the world have representative government. Whoever we selected to represent us at a certain point became in charge of the government. Depending on how many votes or seats they either had outright majorities or coalitions, and whoever then is in charge of the government decided on an approach to take. Now, what I find fascinating is that the populace has largely been excluded from every single discussion, as far as one can tell. And I think if we then look at, let's say, what governments are putting in place to address these things, we are actually seeing a massive takeover of state, of privacy and human rights, without anybody going boo. It's quite shocking about how pliant mass numbers of people have come over losing all of their rights. And what history shows us is that many people have to fight for many years to stop these type of invasions of privacy coming in. Once, however, they are in, they're really, really hard to undo again. Also, these governments cannot be trusted with the powers that they've been given. How do we know that? Well, the Edward Snowden leaks about what the United States was doing with Patriot Acts and their spying methods shows that the governments absolutely cannot be trusted, should not be trusted, never should have been trusted. And so why we suddenly want to trust them now is just bizarre. It does create some avenues for potential for hope. However, I would naturally be more negative, because humans, whilst they're lovely, tend to like watching Netflix, pornography, buying stuff and going and have beers, and tend not to understand how the democratic process is vitally important for their lives, and tend not to understand that unless you take an interest in it and are able to constructively and productively play with it, bad people will take over. And we will see bad people taking over. If anybody has looked at what Hungary has been doing, their emergency laws being passed pretty much allows Orban, democratically elected, to now rule as a dictator. And whilst the opposition said, hey, maybe you should put a time limit, because he had so many more seats in parliament, it's without time limit. There are things included in the laws that say, okay, you can't put out press that would, let's say, sort of hurt the government. Well, this is a perfect recipe to arrest everybody. And we can see it happening. And what's interesting then is that will we do anything about it? Now, what could be done from a European Union perspective is that you can already start sanctioning procedures and stop giving them money. That would be a thing to do. And what becomes interesting is that if these things are not done, the only lesson that, let's say, bad people can get is that you should do more of this. This is a problem because our society has largely been driven and run by people that have a collective view or understanding that most people are good, most people do the right thing. We're really quite surprised when some people don't do the right thing. Hello, Anna. Hello, Jean. Hello, Stephen. Hello, everybody. So we are at a huge risk in all of our societies that we may have accidentally just completely changed our world order and have just completely moved away from democracy into statism and potentially autocracy practically overnight without anybody noticing, because we can't even gather in our streets and complain about it. Hey, Christian. Because we're not allowed to. Fascinating. Let's go back to the virus then, because one of the interests that I had, and thank you very much, my Facebook, for giving me the everyday person's view on how things work. I put out in doing my strategic work a few weeks ago, I was looking at how can we as humanity, let's say, handle this thing. Because right now, with the way that the virus incubates, with the way that the virus has carriers who are asymptomatic, who are, let's say, infected, and to some extent suffering, these people are not suffering with symptoms, and yet they have the same or largely similar infection possibilities. So research done in Iceland of some 5 or 10% of its population, so still relatively small, found that if you test everybody, a very decent number of the population are positive currently, but asymptomatic. So they experience no symptoms. These will be infectious to others because the disease we know is not airborne. That means it doesn't float around. It's droplet based, which means that you've got about 1.5 meters. If you sneeze it out, 4 meters, but people tend not to sneeze with this particular type of disease. So we go around spitting at people. And I'm sure if I look at my screen, it'll be covered in some sort of spit. Yucky, don't go there. But what happens then is that if you are asymptomatic, you're not coughing, which has more velocity, more projection, more volume. You're just being normal. The thing, though, is that you still have in proximity, and with also sort of allowing the virus to, let's say, sort of be kept on surfaces, the ability to transmit. So asymptomatic people are generally going to be very good for our population's immunity building and base, because after that period of being infectious, then not infectious, they would have the antibodies up to be immune. The thing is, though, that they can still be transmitting for a period of time, which would be somewhere to, yes, we'll talk about staying sane as well. We can get into that. But so it means that gradually we are building up populations around the world where you have people that are largely asymptomatic, which will have therefore built up immunity to the virus. And this will ultimately be helpful for us to move on from this. Where we have, it also means that if we look at the death rate from this virus, it is dramatically overstated, quite possibly by a factor of 10. And that's because as the virus continues to spread through populations that don't show symptoms, show mild symptoms, and in any case aren't being tested, these numbers, if it's a 5% average, which it was when I looked earlier this morning, may end up that it's more like 0.5 or 1.5% as a fatality rate. We won't know maybe even for another sort of year and a half, just with how things sort of finally play out. But this is still something that's not good. And we then see that clearly human life is precious. We can argue, if you are a health provider or an insurance company, exactly how expensive precious really means. But right now, quite often, because you have so many people all with exactly the same type of symptoms, needing almost the same type of treatment, particularly if you look at ventilators, respirators, it means that the healthcare systems of the world are getting sort of stuck. And that means that you end up with tough choices being made in Italy, who lives and dies. You also end up with a diversion of medical resources to this one virus, which means other people don't get treated. And we can see that countries like the United States, with California and with New York, have their hospital ships, and those hospital ships aren't intended for corona patients. They're designed for treating other people. And we're seeing many of these other temporary sort of hospital facilities being set up with the purpose of treating these non-corona people. Now, I can share maybe some sort of upside or some sort of positive things in an area that I've been working on, and then I'll get into some of the questions. And remember, if you're watching this thing, please put your questions in, we will go through them. One of the projects that I've been working on is using antibody therapy as a way of giving short-term immunity to patients. So now, if anybody is interested, I did write a course, a training course. And what I'm meant to be doing is education of 21st century skills online and offline. Well, I did write a course on speed learning and how to become how to have expert conversations with experts in a half an hour to 3 hours to 3 days. And as I began to get more and more into the immunity idea, I was looking in, well, how does the virus work? And then particularly, how do you become immune to the virus? Some of you may remember, if you've been looking at my Facebook feed, the safe infection hotel and managed care. Well, more and more people that I read about in the press are trying to be sort of safely infected and having their care managed. And I can see this happening still more and more, whether or not it's sanctioned by governments, whether or not you'll get covered under your health insurance. The reason why I was looking at that is, statistically, if you are below 50 years old without a pre-existing condition, and probably if you're not a smoker as well, stupid idea, stop it if you know people, then you have at least a 99.1% chance of not going to hospital. And because that's only based on published numbers of test cases, and we know that tests aren't being given in many places, it means that probably there is a 99.4 or 99.6% chance that you won't go to hospital. And I'm not talking about a respirator, I'm saying even go in through the front door of the hospital for, let's say, first line of treatment, because there's a difference between hospitalization and acute care. What the safe infection hotel as an idea or concept was an interesting one to concentrate people's minds and to sort of free up thinking. It also is an interesting way of seeing how open-minded or closed-minded people are. And it turns out, in a world that is changing rapidly, closed-minded people aren't the future. Because they're not. Because if you're closed-minded and the whole world has changed and you haven't accepted it, then you're not the ones who are going to survive and thrive in the world, because you're just the mental capacity to change your thinking isn't there. Now, going down the concept of safe immunity turns out created issues, primarily that you don't know the viral load that a person would get. So if I go to the shops, which I'll have to do tomorrow, I will have some sort of viral load about walking around because I have to buy some food. Um, if I then go and buy some contact lenses and then I go to the drugstore, I'll get more viral load in. Now, it may be most likely because I'm in the same place, it'll be the same strain because it tends to be geographically done. But it may be that if all of a sudden I get coughed on at the last second by somebody with a huge load, maybe then I'm not just sort of experiencing, let's say, a small bit, but a lot of it, and they could change the progression of the virus through my body. The safe infection idea, though, was primarily a case of how can you isolate people, give them a safe dosage in a controlled way of the virus as harmlessly as possible. And you can give people deactivated viruses because there's a clinical trial in London from a company called HVivo doing that. And then you would be able to be safely cared for hotel or in the community, which means you can go into your Facebook group, you can share what you're doing, look at videos, etc., have your paracetamol. So it turns out the treatment for the vast majority of people will cost about $5 worth of paracetamol. Wow, this is why we're destroying our entire economy. I have great empathy with the people that are skeptics in this area. And then after that process, it takes between 6 and 10 days to recover for 99.5% of the population. And after that, you're still infectious in some ways, primarily as it's working its way through its body in other places. And then after 14 days, you'd be able to go out into the society and help work in an old age people's home, work in hospitals, etc. One of the things that was interesting is that when we started to speak to experts on how could you safely deliver the virus if you had to, one expert that we spoke to, who is a very, very bright PhD student at Tel Aviv University working on anti-venom projects, when he was open-minded enough to have a conversation, he actually said, well, if we could give a deactivated version of the virus, that does have some risks, but really what we want is the antibodies. So we began, first of all, to look at an old style of vaccine where you take the virus live, you deactivate it, so you heat it up or put formaldehyde. That keeps its nasty sort of crown structure out. And that you just take that structure with a dead virus in, inject it in, and that will stimulate the process of antibodies. Well, that gives you an old style of vaccine. However, that does take quite a while to test. One of the reasons why vaccines take so long to test is that in the 1970s, the United States got really, really into vaccination of populations. And sometimes they got the disease right. Sometimes they vaccinated people for no reason because the disease didn't spread. But if the thing was mixed up wrong, some people had very, very nasty diseases that came out. And because of that, there's a lot more testing around vaccines and a lot more time it takes, therefore, for a vaccine to actually go to market. Now, this time is therefore a problem because as we have healthcare workers at risk, it means that a healthcare worker that is currently in quarantine or isolated can't help other patients for a period of 14 days or longer. At the moment, this is not the case in, let's say, Italy necessarily, because sadly they just have it full on. But if you look at countries that haven't yet experienced massive volumes of patients or potential infected, particularly Africa, Latin America, where it's bubbling up but not yet, because of our isolation method, it means that these people are sort of hugely at risk. And if the frontline people aren't there, it just means that the system gets slammed much faster. So one of the ways to do this then was to do antibody therapy, because then if we just give healthy people an immunization shot based on antibodies from recovered people, this would give them short-term vaccinations, short-term immunity that would last 2 months, maybe 3. It can be boosted as well. And this then gives this idea of short-term vaccination. Now, if anybody's more deeply interested in it, we have a paper, we're going out to research laboratories, and hopefully this will be a new weapon that we can have. One of the inspirations that I had when I was thinking about this, just so I could understand the PhD guy, was that in, I think it was Singapore and Japan, they already were doing plasma treatments, so taking blood plasma from recovered patients and giving it to sick other patients. It turns out, and hello Salima, lovely to see you. It turns out that the majority of these are being used as treatments, which means you can almost use it immediately because these are sort of fairly known things. But then this insight that we had was we can use this to vaccinate. And that creates a safe ring of people in critical functions, critical government functions even. And those people can then safely treat people. They can safely diagnose. They can safely help other patients as well. And even though they need to maintain standards of cleanliness because virus could be on their coats, they're not infecting themselves and they have no risk of being infected themselves for that period of time. So that's one of the projects that we've been working on. And when I say we, there's about 30 people and it's now broken down to about 20 volunteers. There are other projects as well that I can talk about later if you want. And if you would like to volunteer for something, because you'd like to do something, please let me know. Other projects that we have, just so that you have an idea, there is the Corona Nation. Corona Nation is a new group. I can't share it right now, but if you Google Corona Nation, we're creating a community of concerned people, of infected people that are going through the process of recovering, and a process of people that have recovered. Some of them, they were tested positive. Some of them, their friends were tested positive. They have the same symptoms. But this is going to be a Facebook group of people who have gone through the process so they can help others. Because it's very traumatic for people that are not doctors to look after sick children at home, and they're trying to work out, is my child about to die, or do I just need to give them paracetamol, kiss them on the head, and wish them good night? So that community would be very helpful. Another reason why it's helpful is that as we're having more and more thousands of people recovering from this disease, it will be really helpful if in a period up to 1 month after they first got infected, they were able to donate blood and therefore donate the blood plasma and serum that we need to extract the antibodies, which can go in to help other people. If I look at the, I can take some questions on this. So that's one project, and there are some other projects as well. I can look for the questions, and I have to check my phone because it looks as though Facebook takes over my gadget. One of the questions that I had was from Maris. So a really good question. He says, I'd like to hear your opinion why we don't have a worldwide lockdown for 3 to 6 weeks, just like in Italy. Instead, we let a few businesses work while others are being forced to shut down everything. This, therefore, could take months, if not years. Well, let's look at that. Very, very good question. So why don't we have a worldwide lockdown? Well, actually, let's just say, why don't we have a worldwide why do we not have a worldwide anything? Well, this is now quite fascinating. It turns out we do not have a global governance structure. We do not have a global you might have a global collective consciousness, kind of, but we don't have the structures, we don't have the logic, we don't have the budgets. Society does not operate as a global entity. Our global entity, we work on countries, we work on regions, and some of those countries, such as Germany, where I'm at now, they have a federal structure, a state or land structure, and then you may even have structures in the Bezirk that you're in. So there is no common structure that is existent in the country of Germany, and Germany is a member of the EU, but there's no common structure for health in that. And then we have different societal values from China, or Singapore, or Argentina, or Brazil. So even if there was a logic that would say, wouldn't it be all good if we stopped? It's impossible to have it. That's because on our beautiful Earth, there are 8 billion people separated into 190-something country units, and each country has the democratically designed ability to do what their leaders want. What it means then is also, if we look at the fine balance required when these decisions were taken, because the decision to close down an economy for a month is materially bad for many people. Now, what does that look like? I read a German economist saying that if the German economy is working at half its production rate for 1 month, Germany loses 4% of its GDP. That means 2 months worth of lockdown is 16% of its gross domestic product. In the United Kingdom, Every 4 weeks of school lockdown was estimated to cost the United Kingdom 3% of its GDP. We'll very quickly find out if these numbers are right. If you like, these are, let's say, experimental, God, I know that we'd never do it, but I wonder how it's going to work. Well, now we can find out. Now we've been able to find out that if you close down all of your factories, air pollution gets better. Who'd have thunk it? So now we have a solution for global warming. We just have to close down all economic activity, and then we don't have a problem anymore. Now, that might be fine if you're wealthy, have a nice house, garden, etc., and your savings are in gold bullion and toilet paper. Problems that you then quickly have at the parallel side is, what does it mean to your population? So the United States only had 3.3 million people unemployed in the first month, and that was primarily because their employment systems broke down, so they couldn't have everybody register that wanted to register. And you have many job types where you're employed 0 hours and you have no income. I was looking at the St. Louis Federal Reserve saying that even though Steve Mnuchin has said the Commerce Secretary has said, well, okay, Treasury Secretary has said, well, okay, we could be looking at 20% unemployment. They've said it could be as high as 35%. Well, let's think about this. 60% of Americans have hourly wages. That means that their jobs can disappear kind of hour to hour. Many of them don't have long-term contracts. Most states have at-will contracts, which means you can be fired immediately for any reason, or else you might have a 2-week notice period. This is very different to Europe, so let's get a little bit of empathy for people that aren't exactly like us. 25% of Americans have 0 savings in the bank. 0, as in actually no money whatsoever. Another 23% of Americans have enough money to survive between 1 and 3 weeks. Another 25% of Americans have enough money to survive between 3 weeks and a couple of months, and only 1/3 of Americans have any form of savings enough to last more than 3 months. Well, that's America, and this is a wealthy country. When you stop, this is 28 million Americans have no health insurance. When you lose your job, you also lose your health insurance. So quite probably by next month, it'll be 35 million without health insurance. That means you can't get your medicine for the other stuff, which is not corona-related. I don't know how many of you have, in many countries, the governments are saying that they will pay the rent. Well, that's not strictly true. In the majority of places, if you actually look at the small print writ large, the governments are saying you will not get thrown out of your house if you don't pay the mortgage or if you don't pay the rent. However, you still owe the money. We can restrict how much interest you're being charged and other charges, but you will still owe the money. So, I don't know how many of you have ever experienced it, but I'd like you to imagine not having income for 4 months. At the end of that 4 months, you have no prospect of a job. You owe 3 months worth of rent and the electricity bills and. Your credit card bill, so the average household credit card bill in America is $8,500. So you still owe that money as well. So you've gone from, let's say, starting off 2020 happy as a clam thinking about your holidays, into all of a sudden you're just sort of massively in debt and you might have no job. This is very traumatic. Stress, heart disease, etc., etc. There are many things that are likely to happen as a result of this, particularly then when you look at people really beginning to sort of lose income. They might have to sort of forego important medicines, take them less often, etc., etc. So we've got a worldwide issue. Why didn't we do this? The issue about should it be 3 to 5 weeks? Well, this is a bit of a problem. How long will the lockdown go on in your countries? Well, most countries now have become, let's say, relatively okay at managing the propaganda for the population, and I'm using that word specifically correctly. Edward Bernay's time, great book if you haven't read Propaganda. Right now, populations are being conditioned, it'll last for 2 weeks. And then on day 10, they're told, well, actually, it's going to last for another 2 weeks. And fortunately, because humans seem to have no memory whatsoever, we just say, oh, wow, that's okay. Another 2 weeks, no problem. And so what you find is that there's no way this is a 4-week problem with this chosen approach. There's no way it's even a 6-week problem. We end up with, let's say, when can we stop? Because even if we're saying we've just about reached the peak, it's like a slope. So once you've reached the top of the mountain, you still have to walk down at the other side again. And because of the way this virus works and it's extremely infectious in our human environments, the ability to have a second wave or third wave is considered guaranteed in most countries. Let me go. And so the next problem that there is, even with the lockdowns, is that when Chinese doctors were going over to Italy, they were shocked because they said there is no lockdown in Italy. Because if you look at the exceptions, people could still go to work. The factories were still open, which means that you need to have a public transport system to get the factory workers there. Food needs to be made for them, and all the factory workers are going there and going back again. In some countries, they've allowed churches to operate, which therefore means that the virus is able to spread, be passed over through any time when humans are able to aggregate and congregate together. In London, there are pictures of the Tube. So the Tube looks a little bit crowded than normal, but it's still very crowded. So we're not really doing the type of physical distancing required anyway. Now, there's I posted on my Facebook feed a few days ago some really interesting modeling of diseases. An epidemiologist has got this nice computer program where you have dots that get infected and stuff. And he worked out with his analysis that if you have a 10% non-compliance to physical distancing, it's basically the same as 50% non-compliance. What that means is that if enough people are still moving around, connecting and everything else, you still have infections going slightly less than normal, but still ruthlessly. And so, and what I've seen is that I saw a number of 30% non-compliance to social distancing. I can't remember which country it's from. But already it's sort of clear that it's really, really hard, even after a few days, for people to sort of do it properly. And you can begin to see that if this goes on for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, particularly in those countries where it begins to get sunny and people want to go outside, it's going to be really hard for populations to be told, don't go out. Because are we going to be like Uganda and Kenya, where we start shooting our population for going outside to have an ice cream? An issue. So yes, let me take a couple of the other ones. If I look at, there was a question from Munia, hello, about vitamin C boosting the immune system. So as a general thing, I have some doctor friends, and one of them, Claudia, was very into encouraging people to do as much as they can to keep their immune system high and good and helpful. Actually, yeah, and we'll talk about Sweden, Marcus, because I'm fascinated by Sweden, and I know that you're in it. So I'm rooting for Sweden, as I've said. But if we look at the immune system, so we have an immune system, and it's a pretty remarkable thing. We're able to develop immunity to things by sort of coming into contact with it. We then remember it for years. And most people have fairly decent immune systems. Now, what is important is that you should all think about keeping a high immune system. Now, this does not mean to say you need to believe wackadoodle Gwyneth Paltrow garbage. This does not mean to say that you start needing buckwheat in every pancake that you have, that you need to start licking kale. Basic things for immune system: try to avoid alcohol or limit alcohol. I don't know if anybody of you has had a hangover recently, but it's not very good on your immune system. For those of us who've gone to Davos, World Economic Forum, it turns out that if you party 5 days, have no sleep every day, drinking alcohol 8 or 9 hours for the day, and not having any decent food, well, you get sick for 3 weeks because your immune system just is not there for it. So having generally a good immune system, doing things to help improve it a little bit, these are all good, but you don't need to do wackadoodle. Now, you could do wackadoodle if you want, and there's always a market for some potion, cream, or supplement. Right now, as far as my household is concerned, we don't particularly drink alcohol. I do have a immune boosting potion that I remember to have once a day, and has bits of zinc and other stuff. But apart from that, I've done nothing particularly special, but we do have fresh vegetables and things like that. Another question from Jean about pretty much the sort of quinine treatment. So when it goes to treatments, you have, so one of the things to understand is that Donald Trump is fighting an election by the end of the year, and he wants to be in power because power is good. And if he loses power, he knows that whoever comes in next might go after him, and in whichever states might go after him next. So Donald Trump wants to win an election. This is how best to understand the US response to this whole virus, is pretty much Trump wants to win an election. Now, what he was forced to realize is that this thing is real, it's not going to go away, and that unfortunately the chosen way of, let's say, handling it in the absence of any, let's say, plausibly well-argued solution to the contrary is now a 25% reduction in the stock market, potentially likely to be 50%, a loss of tens of millions of jobs, and he'll go down as the president that made the biggest destruction to any to the U.S. economy in, I don't know, in all possible memory. The thing is, then, he's desperate, and he's desperate for Hail Marys, because if he can have a Hail Mary to say, I found a solution. Now, in the case of the hydroxychloroquine, there were experiments already done in, I guess it was in Asia. But what those experiments showed is that patients in hospital who were under severe treatment, when given this, were able to recover, I think it was about 50% earlier. And I think as long as the PP tapes are on the plane, Jean, then maybe that'll be the case. So what is interesting then is that, I mean, there are many treatments that are being tried. Drug companies that had something for SARS, like, oh, maybe it works. It's very good that there's in, let's say, these wartime conditions in many hospitals, people are open to different types of treatment. And anybody that's hospitalized deserves the best care that's available, and we need to test and work these things out. Now, there are issues with, let's say, jumping the gun and saying this thing works. Some of you may have read about the couple in Arizona that ate their fish tank desalination, whatever, cleaning solution, which had a differently chemically composed hydroxychlorine solution. So these people both were frothing at the mouth in 10 minutes and died like the man died and the woman was still there. So those are treatments. Now, what I've been looking at, particularly from my side, are vaccinations rather than treatments. But I mean, there are many treatments that we will see coming out. The one book that I read when I was doing a lot of innovation work was called The Fruits of War. And you see that in wartime, let's say, budgets might become available that weren't there. People are desperate and willing to try out new things. So I would say it is a tentative treatment already. It's controversial because the president decided we're going to do it even if the FDA hadn't declared it. And I think we just have to wait very quickly to see if there are patient outcomes that come out. Now, what's interesting is that there are enough patients of these things happening now that we're able to do tests relatively fast. What this means is that if France is doing a test, I think it was going to be 1,000 patients, we'll find out in 2 or 3 weeks whether it worked or not. And if that's the case and France has worked out and tested, yes, it's the solution, this could then be scaled up clearly to the US and other places. One of the downsides of taking the solution is that it creates a huge run on that particular drug or medicine, and that there are other diseases, particularly lupus, that requires that drug to sort of control lupus, and that's running short. And even I know in place in Berlin, about, I think it's 90% of medicines in the United States come from China. We have a number of our medicines that come from China, and there's less and less flights going, although at least cargo flights are still going in most countries. There's a risk of supply chain shortages and not getting the drugs that you want, et cetera, which is very scary for anybody that has a condition that requires taking of drugs and medicines. Because if you know that you need to take your diabetes medicine and you don't have it, well, these things are death sentences. Okay, let's go for other questions. So one question was like somebody sent me a question about what is normal, like when will we be getting to normal? Well, it's really interesting. If we begin to, let's say, think through what is happening now, and if we start to think about what are the consequences of our behaviors and actions now that will carry forward. One of the things, if you look at the workplace, is that many people are still working, and some people have had more meetings now than they would have had in the same physical time because they're not traveling backwards and forwards. And I think a lot of companies will realize that travel time is wasted time. And if we're able to pretty much now force senior executives to, oh my God, use a Zoom call, then you'll end up with fewer travel. So I think it is very plausible that when business restarts, particularly as we won't be able to use airplanes for a goodly while, and I don't know about you, but I don't want to do a 2-day trip to a place where I've got a 14-day quarantine when I arrive at the place and then a 14 quarantine when I get back home. I don't want every trip to pretty much be like an old transatlantic ship trip. So we're not going to be traveling for a while. So even as our businesses begin to be real established, we will be having a lot of these virtual meetings. Now, that will have a severe implication on the travel industry, because then it means that all of these nice 5-star business hotels that people used to schlep to, or the 3-star hotels if you have a cheaper employer, those will be certainly at lower capacity and maybe plausibly empty. The business restaurants that would make money out of people always being in a workplace, always having a communal lunch, more and more of those will struggle because we'll have more remote work. Other things you'll find is that when economies collapse, you can get really good employees fairly cheaply. And if we were working remotely, why would I need to spend whatever 240 grand for an engineer in California when I could get a brilliant person for whatever 80 grand in Ukraine? Good for the person in Ukraine, sucks to be the person in California, because that doesn't even give them, let's say, enough money to really sort of get on very well. But so you can begin to see more and more remote working coming in place inside of companies. Those are some of the implications we have. There are the people who, let's say, on their dating profile, they say, love walks on the beach and love travel. Well, when are we going to be able to travel again? Now, clearly, the countries that are living off tourism, and some of them get 30% of their revenue out of tourism, are desperate to have people come back. And yet, because of our chosen way of handling the disease, we're not going to be traveling for a while. It's going to be really, really hard. You will see the brave be the first people to sort of venture out and try to travel. For those people, they will be desperately welcomed and greatly loved by all of the places. Oh my goodness, our first tourist from Germany has finally arrived in Spain. It's been 3 years since you've been here. Please take it out. So that will then sort of come slowly. You're likely to see more in-country tourism just because our way of handling lockdown has been to control what we can control, which are typically country and regional borders. And so it means that you're more likely to have people, if they do go on holiday and can afford it, will be doing things locally. So those are other implications. Problems that you do have is that you'll have companies going bankrupt. It would suck to be you, obviously, and sucks to be their staff, and it would suck to have them as customers, and it would suck to have them as your vendor. Now, I've lived through, so I'm a 12-year-old child, as some of you know. My human body is 50 on this planet. I've gone through a number of different recessions, and I know that recessions can be brutal. They can last a long, long time. And the way you act in a recession is fundamentally different from when you act in a growing economy. Now, many of my friends are, let's say, late 20s, early 30s, and you may never have experienced a recession before. What that means is quite interesting. It means then that typically in a recession, if you own a business, you need to cut your costs as fast as possible and assume that it's going to be this bad for ages. That's a safer way of doing things. Next, you need to preserve cash, which means that you want to pay your suppliers late, if possible, not pay out anything, because cash becomes extremely precious. You need to become extremely nimble about what your customers want. And whatever they want, do that. Because if you are, let's say, in many industries, people are used to taking orders and really sort of being very pushy to their customers. Well, in a recession, your customers will be just as desperate as you are. So if you can find out what they want to do and you can kind of do it for them, this at least gives you a source of revenue. you need to be very nimble and be very responsive to the marketplace, because those needs could change quite quickly. All of a sudden, things could tip up really fast. Um, the way that money will start flowing through the economies, which will happen as these trillions of dollars gets pumped in from central banks and from countries borrowing shitloads of money to give out to people, that money will go somewhere. It won't go somewhere evenly, which means that there are some areas of the economy which will look as though they're doing much better than others. We will also see, even though, I mean, I've been expecting a 10 to 15% GDP hit of various economies around the world, just because stop producing for 2 months, that will give you about 10% hit. You will have from this low base an increase of the economies, and some of these economies might grow faster than they've ever grown, but that's only because most people are bad at math. So, but it does mean that there'll be certain bright spots of things beginning to start. Normally, it's nice to think about creating new businesses, but you have to be really, really careful about spending any money on them, because we don't have a clue what's happening now. We don't have a clue what's going to happen in 3 months' time. We don't know what it's going to be like in 6 months' time. And that type of uncertainty as a business person makes it really, really hard to plan. And it makes saying no the easier option. This might be for yourself, but think about if you have a business that requires sponsors. So let's say you want to do a big conference and you just expect tech companies will sponsor my conference. Well, it's easier for them to say no than yes, because I don't know if there's going to be an ability to have a conference in October. So these are some of the implications. And will we ever have normal again? I mean, if we look at how most countries have lived their lives, and even the places that have had wartime and really hard times, it does come back. So humans like to connect with other humans. That's not going to change. Most humans like other people. So we'd rather connect to some people that we find cool, that like the same music as us. That's not going to change. Some of us don't know how to cook anymore. So going out to restaurants, that's not going to change. I think then you will see progressively over the next 6 months, 18 months, we have semblance of things getting back to normal. The tricky thing, though, is that if you look at about the money at the same time, I think that high-end restaurants will really struggle, because a lot of the people that would go to high-end restaurants have money invested in the stock market, and if that's down 20, 30%, they won't feel wealthy. If they have employees, they won't feel wealthy if they've had to fire 40% of the staff. So high-end things will begin to struggle. I think you're more likely to see people as they go out go for cheaper options. So whereas, let's say, I think it's also going to hurt the middle options as well. So, but people do like to hang out, connect together, etc. You will have, I mean, this sort of prolonged period for people to be forced to be together. You will have lots of divorces, given that that's a very popular sort of human structure of being married. You will have new couples being created. I've got some friends who, let's say, had to choose the new boyfriend of a month. Do I have him meet my parents and we live on a farm for the next 2 months or 3 months? So you will have new couples being created, but just kind of as it always is. And there will definitely be a pent-up demand for humans to do human things as soon as the lockdown is over. So one can imagine a magical spring or summer when everybody just sort of goes out and does their thing. Let's go from if it's the clear, like, how am I staying safe? The very good question. So in the last, I've now gone out to forest. So if I could sort of see outside my house, I've got loads of trees, and pretty much there's a forest that starts at the end of my garden. And I was being very well behaved and not going out. I've now decided that there's nobody in the forest whatsoever. I did do a little scope around to see if there were police cars about, but so now I go for a walk by myself in the forest, surrounded by nothing but very, very loud chirping birds and maybe the odd squirrel. So that's quite nice, because I'm used to traveling to a different place every week. Now, clearly I won't do that, but so now my international travel is to go to the lake. That already at least sort of helps a bit. I think then being active in, I look at the news constantly. The corona news for a while got too much, So I had to reduce the sources that I had to look at just the specific things. But what I've been focusing on is doing some projects that can make value. And then having Zoom calls and chats with people. Although even then, I've been over-Zoomed. So now I'm actually trying to avoid people wanting to do Zoom calls because it's too much social interaction for me. Uh, let's talk about Sweden now. Unfortunately, because this is broadcast medium, not a Zoom thing where people can chime in. I think Sweden is super interesting. I think the UK got publicly a lot of stick because UK press tends to get picked up because it's in English. And Boris Johnson, at least, is an internationally reputed clown, so that people they know who he is, and so his stories go out. England tried to go down this idea of, let's say, developing immunity through the population, if I technically avoid herd immunity. The UK's problem was always going to be unions and railway workers, not so much they didn't buy into it, but is that their employers would be bastards and not pay people. So as soon as I could see that railway workers were complaining that if they were forced to quarantine for 14 days, they wouldn't be paid, I could see that unions would step in and then say, look, we're going to go on strike and there's no more trains. The same thing on the teaching side. So teachers' unions in the UK are fairly powerful. And I could see quite quickly that what would happen is that more and more teachers would go off sick. There's therefore not enough teachers in the school. And all the teachers would have to say is, hey, give us a pay rise or danger money for going to work in these places, or we're not going to teach. The UK was always going to be forced to do that because fundamentally their employers are cheapskates and they're not paying people what should be paid for, let's say, the equivalent of danger money in these trying times. And in fact, one of the big employers for public service workers in the United Kingdom wanted to pay statutory sick pay of £94 a week, which is not a lot of money if you've lived in England before, if you were forced to quarantine or had coronavirus, and they were forced to stand down because the unions fought against them. The Netherlands was, let's say, the second-tier country trying to do this, and they've also now had to go back because this wall of pressure, and propaganda is again a decent word to say. I'd like to say this is the only way of handling this particular disease. And because there's no alternative that's really out there, in the majority of countries, those people have managed to get their way, and those experts or scientists have bullied their governments into closing down their economies as the chosen strategy. Sweden is, let's say, relatively fortunate in that it's a small country. It's not massively populated. It has population densities in a number of cities, but it's not massive. It is a relatively young population. It has a fairly strong concept of society, and there is pretty high trust in Swedes amongst other Swedes. I was looking at, I think the trust that Swedes have in other Swedes is something like 66%, and in Germany it's 44%. So there can be a general trust of, if you are sick, you stay at home, which means that if I meet you, you're not sick. It's going to be interesting to see what happens. Now, just because the virus affects lots of people, and then there's a percentage that will be hospitalized and a percentage that are old, that are more likely to be hospitalized, you will begin to hit up on the limits of how many beds that are available, certainly in main areas. Well, already France has been shipping people across France to balance out their hospital system. In Malmo, I think there's relatively few infections and relatively few hospitalized, so it's not difficult to imagine Stockholm alleviating its pressure by having people move. What I think is interesting for Sweden is that right now they haven't had to give out massive stimulus packages for businesses. They have closed down schools. They have put a limit of 50 people gathering together. The economic impact that Sweden will have will be dramatically less than for all the other countries. This means their citizens will owe less money collectively to pay back the debt. Interest rates will be much lower in Sweden, which means therefore they don't pass on higher mortgage costs and borrowing costs to companies in Sweden. Because their companies kept manufacturing, they're likely to gain market share because other countries aren't making anything. I think that it's an interesting notion about, is a society, how precious is the life? Because In the United Kingdom, which I know quite well, the NHS has their sort of so-called death board that they work out, well, how much money are we willing to pay to give somebody a treatment? And clearly, there's certain amounts of money that today's society is not willing to pay. Well, I did a calculation on the cost of the coronavirus about 3 weeks ago, and I was looking at the currently we are spending tens of millions of dollars for every person that is hospitalized with corona. That's a lot more than cancer. That's a lot more than heart disease. That's a lot more than lung cancer, and. So collectively, without a democratic decision, we've decided to massively indebt the populations of the world and impoverish many of them, potentially forever, for this one disease. And I think, therefore, the Sweden approach might end up being the most, let's say, heartless from the outside about, oh, you've allowed poor old people to die, and yet may actually be the fairest and nicest way of doing it. And I think it's hard in an era of social media where people can share, I have loads of people sharing with me stories about a 13-year-old girl die. How heartless can you be? It's like, well, statistically, one's going to die. And I think we are manipulated through media. We do not have the individual tools, by and large, to be able to process these stories in a way that is rational from a system level. We get super excited by saying, 30% of people go to hospital. Okay. Without, let's say, taking the time to say what percentage of these people are old and that we're going to die anyway. If you want to find out when you're going to die, the Wharton Life Expectancy Calculator allows you to type in how old are you, whether you smoke or drink, and a couple of other numbers, and then it'll tell you when you're going to die. Fascinating. So I like that kind of thing because I like systems. Most people would find that horrible and hideous and horrendous. Now, in their Myers-Briggs styles, you're probably an F, a feeling person, and a thinking person. Well, I'm a thinking person. I like thinking. Thinking is brilliant. Thinking builds space rockets. Thinking is how we get out of this problem. It's not by empathizing dramatically with everybody, because ultimately we have to think our way out of this thing and not just sort of rock with it. So I think that Sweden will be very interesting. They were likely to have, let's say, plausibly maybe a few more deaths than other places, unlikely to be dramatically more. They will end up, though, potentially with an immune population, which means they're less going to be prone to getting hit next time. They'll end up with an economy that is dramatically better off, which means that they can invest more, take market share, etc. I'm very positive about, but the thing is that Sweden is generally a wealthy country. I see in places like Mexico, they may have a lot more problems, and India will be just another story altogether. So I'll just catch up with some of the comments. Another one from Sweden. Okay, let me go back to another question. Any comment on Russia flying medical help to the United States? Well, Russia flew medical help to Italy. It was an entirely pure publicity stunt. They sent the wrong equipment. The stuff didn't work. Russia is just doing publicity stunts because Russia doesn't materially have anything to offer. With oil being at whatever, $23, $24 a barrel, I think when oil was about $60 a barrel, the Russian economy with 110 million people was the same size of Spain. I guess with oil at $25 a barrel, it's going to be the same size of, I don't know, Luxembourg. So Russia is about theater, primarily theater for their own populations. And America kind of has always liked having Russia there because it gives them an enemy. And Trump likes Russia a lot. So, and there are reasons why Trump likes Russia. I think that Trump will absolutely say thank you. He'll say that my policy of handling the Russians are fine. But yeah, it's not material in the slightest. So if we look at China resuming production, it's another question in here. So China is producing goods at last. You can see whatever pollution beginning to increase, which means that sort of somebody is sort of using up energy and pumping out some smoke. It's really interesting and fascinating, though, and for me, I find it quite scary looking at what normal is going to be like in China. It's horrible. People are going around all with masks. You need to be temperature checked everywhere. Your phone tracks you everywhere. Your phone gives you yellow, green, or red, which shows are you allowed to move, and based on who you are, people can decide to associate with you. You're going into shops and you begin to see adverts as being these disgusting, like, why would I want to look beautiful when I'm hiding at home because I'm only allowed out for 2 hours? So I can see that, I mean, China is the manufacturing place of the world. We've all realized now. So it's good to a large extent that it's working. I think China also has a problem that its population, even though they can control them massively, many of them are poor. And as they've been consumerized, they need money to live, buy consumer products, etc. So, and China has a real problem itself in that they're worried about reinfection because it's all very well saying that the new infections are coming in from that are travel related. Well, we all had travel related infections as well. They just went out of control. And because China does not have an immune population, best case, maybe there's 250,000 people that had it, even if only 80 something thousand were tested positive. Their immune population is 250,000 max out of a population of 1 billion plus. So they are not immune from this thing, and their worry is that it's going to hit them again. And another worry would be like, can they use the same method of closing down the economy as before? Because it's very, very expensive. So China doesn't have it necessarily easy. At the same time, though, China has, let's say, they've taken advantage of the situation well, because they're the only people that are coming out and can produce at scale. So take market share, etc., etc. If we look at cost of oil, so there's an interesting whammy that's taking place in our society. So right now you have everything, it's a fire sale, everything goes down at the same time. What was interesting is that with the oil war between Saudi and Russia, and everybody else powerless to intervene completely, you end up with a world of cheap oil when nobody wants it. What that means is that there's a capacity to store oil for a period of time, but that capacity is going to be very quickly overwhelmed. And so therefore you will have, and already you have, wells in the United States and other countries stopping production because it's cheaper to not produce than it is to store, because storage also has a cost as well. It's also a play against America, because America's cost of production is around about 35, 40 bucks a barrel. And what's interesting is that the way that fracking works is you need to frack a new well, I think it's every 18 months or 2 years, which means that the United States has to constantly have massive investments of new fracking wells. But that means that all of the companies doing it have massive amounts of debt. Most of them will go bust, and anybody carrying the debt will take a hit on that as well. So there's some clever geopolitics and just good old-fashioned baseball bat type whatever market dynamics going on, where you have Saudi Arabia led by MBS, who's clearly consolidating power nicely in Saudi Arabia, deciding to take a money hit on Saudi over the oil prices for Saudi itself. But knowing that if this thing works, they might take out competitors for some number of years, and that puts Saudi into a driving position again. So we shall see. The thing then is that we're not driving around, so it's not as though any of us can take advantage of the low oil prices, and we're not producing anything because our factory workers don't want to get sick, so it's not even helping us that much. There is, though, likely to be a spike in oil prices at some point, because if oil capacity goes offline, what it means is that it's going to be relatively expensive for some producers, particularly the Americans, to scale up again. And so you may end up with oil then spiking up to 70 bucks at some point before dropping back again. I've been looking at, a thing from Yulia. So hello, Yulia. I'm looking at post-recovery complications from lung function. I have read those. So what you look at is that if you get pneumonia, which is very few cases if you're below 50 without prior conditions, so a tiny number, or but it's more likely you have when you're older. So if you have pneumonia anyway, there is a risk of reduced lung function afterwards if you have pneumonia anyway. Now, I don't know if any of you have seen the 3D scan of how COVID affects the lungs. So normally you have these sort of lung things here, and the pneumonia attacks a sort of small spot, and that can be treated relatively easily. COVID's much more nasty. Basically, the whole lung gets attacked. So research showed that if you have pneumonia, there is a risk of long-term lung damage. And then another study I saw from China said that 20% of patients that were severely ill and then recovered experienced loss of lung capacity between 20 and 30%. So for those people that have light symptoms, which means no pneumonia, it doesn't seem as though there's any long-term impact whatsoever. And normally it shouldn't be, because if you look at the type of symptoms that there are, they seem to be trivial. Now, some people said, what about testicles and what about brain damage? Well, I haven't seen anything vaguely plausible that would say that we have to worry about our lovely testicles and our lovely brains. Now, that might come out later, but at the moment I haven't seen anything whatsoever on that. And it would be quite weird if it were, because that's not how that particular virus sort of moves through the body. I have seen that digestive problems are an issue and a bigger issue than people thought. So it could be that 20% of patients have digestive problems. So it's not just a respiratory disease, but it may also be a digestive disease that sort of goes through the body. But I'd have to do more research on that. If you look at gin stuff, a lot of people in the forest people in the city. Let's see if I have any other questions that came in. I'm happy to go on for another 15 minutes or so, if anybody has anything. So, I mean, maybe if I just sort of conclude by, let's say, some positive things and some negative things. If I think positively on this, in order to change a system, so in order to tip a system from here over here, it needs to be destabilized first. Well, we clearly have a destabilized system at the moment, massively destabilized system. What that means with a destabilized system is that there's an opportunity to tip things. Now, naturally, a system goes back to the way that it was. Also, if a system is destabilized, just because you think it's going to go this way does not mean to say that somebody else could point it in another direction. So there is an opportunity that everything is destabilized, because there's the virus, there's the economy, and there's the virus plus the economy. And this will hit us for at least 2 years, if not more. And we get hit with travel, social interactions, and that. Some good news, therefore, is that when systems are destabilized, it means that the old ways of doing things largely will stop working. This is useful, because once those old systems have stopped working, it forces people to start looking around for alternatives. Hello, Karen. Good to see you. Well, I can't see you, but I can see your name. So this is an opportunity. Now, what's missing right now is that I'm quite surprised at that there hasn't been any form of public pressure on these sort of company bailouts, whether it's in Germany, a little bit in the US, I've seen it, to say, if we're going to bail out your companies, how about you sign up to climate change provisions? At the moment, I haven't seen that. The best that I've seen is that I saw that in the United States, there's a cap on executive salaries of those companies that get money to $400,000 a year. I've seen that. I've also seen public pressure on Barclays Bank saying they'll go carbon neutral by 2050, which is a good way of saying, oh God, you're so stupid, you believed I even said that. 2050, because 2050 is just an imaginary number. So what you should have, or we should have, is, let's say, the public, we the people, have an opportunity to force our representative elected leaders to put strings to all of these things. Now, because the world has changed, I think that if we begin to look at, let's say, what are the messaging that comes out, how could it get in? I think we have a huge opportunity. Now, within the next, let's say, 2 weeks it starts, and then over the next 2 months. At the moment, you can't do it now because people are let's say, frightened and grieving. Then they're going to be bored, and now we want to get even. So within the next 2 months, definitely, we should see movements to really force, if governments have borrowed so much money on our behalf as citizens, and we're just going to throw the money around the place, we want strings attached. We also want strings attached to our democratic processes as well, because we do not trust our politicians, we do not trust our leaders, because they don't deserve trust. And this is, and not for all countries, but for many of these countries, they really do not deserve trust. So This is, I think, something that's positive because we now have leverage on more entities that produce economic value, or it turns out negative in their entire 100 years of producing. Now it turns out that it was basically a net zero, to force people to do more because we have leverage. Now, that only happens through the political process, and that means that politics will become very, very interesting over the next 2 to 5 years. Especially so if we end up with more likely with a likely outcome of a depression rather than a recession. In the stock market trading, there's something called a bear market trap, which says that the market's gone down, it's had a couple of good days and is going up, you think it's going to go up again. And the trouble with the bear market where you're down selling is that basically you can keep going down and down and down and down. Gradually, the insurance companies might need to sell off some of their assets because they have obligations in one side, and they sell off the best asset they have because at least it's worth something. And so you may end up with a situation of unemployment, long-term unemployment, consumer debt, government debt, that could last for years. So that means that we're, let's say, in less of a push to do something to some extent. But it also, though, if we look on the downside, we need to be greatly aware of populists, because a populist should be able to take advantage of the situation and saying, government is wrong, everybody desperate, trust in me, land of milk and honey, vote for me. It would be really easy to design populist movements to take over countries. Similarly, many of the people that are currently in power, once you have a taste of power, particularly if there's billions and billions sloshing around, it's always easy to slosh a billion over there and a billion over there, and you're fine now. It's very easy to imagine that those people currently in power representing their political parties may never want to leave. And because our press has become pliant propaganda engines because of the health crisis, and our populations have become pliant and we're not allowed to gather together, it may mean that we've just given people a free ride, say people that weren't necessarily bad but will become bad, to pretty much move towards autocracies, dictatorships, loss of civil liberties, and. So, and unfortunately, I see this as more likely to happen than not. So it's something to watch out for, and I'm not sure how to combat that yet, but it's something that we should look at as to needing to combat it, because I don't believe that everything is going to be nice. I'm looking at the situation right now. I see more bad things happening than good by miles. And this is before we finish the outcome of the virus. Any other questions? I can't see the raising hands. I quite like Zoom because then you can have people do their own stuff. Jim was saying in Switzerland that I can see non-forest people going into the forest. Yes, it's very unfortunate that one of the things that I'd like to hope to see over the next couple of years is that people learn to be considerate to others, help others. They should share things. We should give people the nasty, stary look that we see when you're walking outside. We should give these people the look that if they're throwing a cigarette butt, we should go up to them and just call them arseholes and just like, you're a disgusting pig, you're a horrible human, get out of my forest. It would be nice if we're able to do that, because at the moment, people have been given a free rein to be inconsiderate to others, wildlife, plants, etc., etc. Some of these people are even celebrated as being cool, and we have to stop that, because they were never cool anyway. It's just that maybe there's a possibility that we can be more forthright in what goes on there. Oh yes, there was a question that Maris had on business opportunities. It's something that I've been looking at as well. So some things that begin to emerge, if you look at the logic of people not traveling, you look at the logic of billions being thrown into the economies, there will be opportunities to make some business. A lot of processes there's opportunities around manufacturing locally, because we now have a risk of our supply chain. Our supply chain may not even function properly for many months. So there is a possibility of getting local manufacturing for more goods, whether it's within the European Union or within a country. So that's a possibility. I've looked at education. So I think that my big project has been on 21st century education and teaching that. And one of the things about changing the education systems of the world is that you needed this kind of thing to happen to change the education systems of the world. Well, this has now happened, and now it turns out that many kids may end up performing just as well or better on their exams by being taught remotely than needing to have a classroom. Maybe it turns out that having a mediocre teacher in a classroom isn't the best way of teaching. You should have a really good teacher who can teach 100,000 people. Why do we have these big buildings when there were kids there? So I think that education is going to be a really big thing as an opportunity. Automation in general, so things where you can reduce human need. So that means AI tools, machine learning tools, robotics, autonomous distribution, drones. You're likely to see drones take off because then why do I need to test an electricity line with a human when I can just fly a drone down there? So these are some business opportunities that I'll be looking at. But by and large, when you are looking at these things, try to spend as little money as possible testing because you need to let the market decide. Eva, great question on the European Union. So I've been thinking about that. And one logic is that the EU will survive because there's nothing else. Now, if we look at the EU as a structure, and then we look at the Eurozone as another structure within that, by Italy and Spain being hit badly, and Greece has got really lucky that it hasn't been hit so far, you have some countries that have got real debt problems now, could become real debt problems in the future. The thing is, at the same time, the European ECB is quantitative easing its way for fun. Other countries of the European Union is creating trillions and trillions of debt. I think it is more likely that the EU will be there, that some of its functions will be structured, primarily because it's the only game in town, and countenancing, trying to imagine doing something other than being in the EU will be unthinkable for countries really, really struggling. Now, at the same time, I think it's entirely plausible that Hungary will be ejected from the European Union within 5 years. I think is quite plausible. So this is not the United Kingdom case of wanting to leave. This is the EU deciding that our values and principles are so strong that either Hungary goes into line or we just cut you, because after all, you're just draining our system anyway, so it's not as though we don't need you per se. So I see that's possible that you might have some countries being ejected from the EU. I do see it as likely that you'll have more EU activity in more areas of life. So already the EU was not really active on a healthcare level, and now we find out with this approach to the pandemic that having some EU structures or support has been helpful. So I think you're likely to see some more things there. It'll be interesting as well to see what will happen to the United Kingdom, because the United Kingdom has got approximately, was it June? So they've got 3 months to negotiate everything with the European Union. And that's if the European Union is able to hold parliamentary things in 27 countries by the end of the year to approve it. So, and the UK is playing hardball, but they'll just try to take it to the wire as they've done for all the other stuff. The UK so far has given in on everything. So it's not as though the UK is particularly, they're a really bad poker players, really, really bad. But I think that will also give more sense of solidarity within the European Union countries to say, well, look, we really are stronger together. Look what's happening to these people. But very good question. So, but I'm still waiting on that one. I'm still looking out to see what happens to get the whispers but I think Schengen might disappear, which would be really sad because I love Schengen. And hopefully that comes back again. But it's this because the only way that we could control the flow of people and goods tied to people has been national borders. I was predicting that was going to happen before. I think Czech Republic or Slovenia was one of the first people to do it, just because that's one of the ways of controlling things. Will it come back again? Well, I could imagine within a year's time, if the virus is under control, particularly if there's vaccination taking place at scale, that there will be a move to make the European Union stronger. And one of the ways of doing that is to say, in that case, we need to put these elements that we liked beforehand, such as Schengen, back in place and make sure that it works. So I don't know. I'm divided right now. It's too early to tell. Um, Well, I'll tell you what, I've now run out of tea and my tea thing is downstairs. I won't tip it out because I'm an idiot. I'd probably spill the drops on me. Um, but thank you very much for listening. I hope this has been useful. If you have any other questions or anything else, you can build stuff around here. You can send me a direct message. But I'd like to say thank you very much. Be safe from the zombie plague and the apocalypse outside. But really, I think about the economy will be worse for most people than everything else. Just be sensible about what you spend. Try not to commit things. Oh yes, and yeah, exactly. Finally like an online doctor's appointment, a web-based interview with a doctor. Why should I have to schlep all of the way there? I think that's really, really good point that Yuli is just making in here about, let's say, a lot of digitization is really going to change things in developed countries like Germany that are very backward, and then developing countries have the ability to leapfrog, which means that those companies, let's say in Ukraine, that are able to come up with solutions, you might find markets like, yeah, sure, it's good. You might find markets like Germany, France, and Britain much more receptive than they would have been later. But anyway, I'm sending lots of love as well. I will give you all lots and lots of virtual hugs. Hey, Michael from Los Angeles, good to hear you as well. And I'm happy to also set up a Zoom call maybe in the next few days as well to have a little bit of a more interactive chat too. And then if anybody likes and remembers my Black Umbrella Society, I will have a session on love and not killing each other. Will be at 8 o'clock this evening as well. So, and I'm happy to share information on that. So I'd like to say thank you very much and lots of love to all of you. And I will see you again one day soon in person. Ciao, ciao. Bye.